I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the battlefront, analyse a suspected Ukrainian ATACMS strike on a Russian space control centre in Crimea, and we discuss this weekend's terrorist violence in Russia's Dagestan region.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 24th of June, 2 years and 126 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor, Nicholls, assistant comment editor, Dearnley, and senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hello, David, and hello, wherever you are. I'm not going to take the weekend news in chronological order because the really big story that's still rumbling on, breaking as we speak, it relates to last night's strike on Crimea. So huge fires have been recorded by NASA satellites at the scene of a suspected Ukrainian ATACMS strike on a Russian-controlled space control centre in Crimea. Ukraine is said to have launched a fresh salvo of ATACMS missiles overnight, last night, Sunday, Monday, with local residents in Crimea reporting loud explosions near several sensitive Russian military sites. One attack is said to have hit the NIP-16 space communications complex and deep space tracking radars, with a locally sourced video showing the complex in flames. Ambulances were later reported to be heading to the site. That if that's impacted Russia's ability to use their satellites, that will have an impact for all sorts of things, from satellite tracking weapons, aircraft, shipping, everything. So if that strike was particularly aimed at the tracking and control systems for satellites, that is very significant. Now, another video showed the launch of several ATACMS missiles from a site in Ukraine. Rockets illuminated the sky as they were fired, but we can't verify when or where that footage was taken. Ukrainian officials say they're waiting for battle damage assessment before confirming the attack, we understand. Russia, in response, has summoned the US ambassador to its foreign ministry over what it said was Washington's responsibility for the strike. And the Russian foreign ministry has said it's told Lynn Tracy, the US envoy, that Washington, quote, bears equal responsibility with the Kyiv regime for this atrocity, unquote. They also said the strike would not go unpunished. Now, other impacts were recorded in Zhezher, Pataria and Dagestan. They're all roughly halfway up the west coast of Crimea and sort of 10 k's to 20, 30 k's-ish due west of the Saki air base. That comes from local media in Crimea. One Yevpatoria resident said, I heard two very powerful explosions in the city. The windows were shaking in my house and ambulance and police sirens were heard in the city. The governor of Sevastopol said an air raid warning had been issued shortly after 10 p.m. local time and that all public transport was suspended for the duration of the attack. So that's what we think happened. And then the bit that's causing the controversy and the reason for the US ambassador to be summoned by Russia's foreign ministry. Russian MOD says shrapnel from an intercepted missile hit a beach packed with sunbathing tourists in the Sevastopol area just after midday yesterday, killing at least 5, including 3 children. A video shot by a tourist on the beach shows a missile coming into view above Sevastopol, above the city, and then exploding. And from the video, it looks like shrapnel crashes into the sand. You hear a succession of thuds and bangs. Tourists are screaming and running away. 2 other videos show tourists using sun loungers to carry injured people off the beach and women in bikinis frantically administering first aid. Now, one of the dead has been named as the 9-year-old daughter of the deputy mayor of a town in the north of the occupied peninsula. Russia's health ministry said 124 people were injured in the incident, including 27 children. Mikhail Rajavev, the mayor of Sevastopol, said the entire healthcare system has been mobilised. Doctors and medical staff are at work. The operating rooms are deployed. Now, Irina Frolova, an eyewitness, she was swimming in the pool of a hotel nearby when she heard air defence systems hitting what is said to have been one of the Ukrainian missiles. She said she then heard screams on the beach and rushed her children to the safety of the hotel and then went down to the beach to help. She was quoted in Russia's Izvestia newspaper, state-owned newspaper, but she said, I went to the beach because I'm a medic. There were a lot of wounded people there, and by the time I arrived, they had already been taken off the beach to the parking lot. I had 8 wounded people. There were mostly shrapnel wounds. A woman was hit in the neck by a double shrapnel. She died. Now, James Kilner, our friend and colleague, reporting in today's paper and online, of course, he notes that attacks on civilian targets are rare inside Russia or Russian-occupied territory, but Ukrainian missile fragments have been known to fall away from military targets in the past, as have Russian missile fragments. This beach is close to the Belbek airfield, which Russia uses to launch fighter jets that regularly target civilian infrastructure elsewhere in Ukraine. Russia says its air defense system intercepted 1 of 5 US-made ATACMS long-range missiles, blamed the US for the attack, as I said earlier, summoned the ambassador, and said the intercepted missile had been armed with a cluster munition warhead that exploded over the beach. Russian MOD said responsibility for the deliberate missile attack on civilians in Sevastopol lies primarily with Washington, which supplied these weapons to Ukraine, as well as the Kyiv regime. No actions will go unpunished. We're not commenting yet, we are just giving you the news. Now, also, there's no comment yet from Putin, but Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, said Putin had been informed of the attack and was in constant contact with his senior military, emergency and healthcare staff. We know Ukraine frequently targets Russian military sites around Sevastopol, but it's usually at night, not so much in the middle of the day. And then this morning, responding on Twitter, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's advisors, the chap that Francis interviewed when we were last in Ukraine, in a very punchy statement, he said, quote, "There are not and cannot be any beaches, tourist zones and other fictitious signs of peaceful life in Crimea. Crimea is definitely a foreign territory occupied by Russia, where there are hostilities and a full-scale war, the very war that Russia unleashed for genocidal and invasive purposes only. Crimea is also a large military camp and warehouse with hundreds of direct military targets, which the Russians are cynically trying to hide and cover up with their own civilians, which in turn are considered to be civilian occupiers," end of quote. Now, it doesn't leave much room for interpretation there. Certainly not a kind of comment, David, that you might think, looking into it, regret all civilian loss of life, etc., etc. So a very hard position there taken by one of President Zelensky's principal advisors. I do ask, can a baby ever be a civilian occupier? But David, there's a lot going on that issue. I better just take a little pause there before giving the other military updates, because there's quite a lot to unpack.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. Can you take us north then? Let's go to the front in Kharkiv. There are some updates from around Vovchansk. Dom Nicholls, what have you seen?
Yeah, so elsewhere in Ukraine, up in the north, around the Vovchansk area, so this is north of Kharkiv, that lodgement, that diversionary attack, whatever it was that Russia launched across the border about 6 weeks ago, which then didn't go very far, didn't do much. Russia's now said to be withdrawing some of its forces from the area after becoming bogged down in the now destroyed town northeast of Kharkiv. This comes from the Ukrainian military. Spokesman for Ukraine's Horizia military group said that Russian forces had also been pulling back from Lipsky. If you remember, so north of Kharkiv, there were 2 Russian across the border there into Ukraine. They never managed to link up. But you've got Vovchansk in the east and the village of Lipsky, a bit smaller that side, but Lipsky in the west. But both sides now seem to be collapsing or moving back in on themselves. Collapse is maybe a strong word. There's no rapid movement, but Russian forces are going backwards there. Now, Nigel Farage, who's a spokesperson for the military grouping, Ukraine's military grouping there, said this movement indicates the enemy has suspended its active hostilities in the area, as they've not conducted any operations over the past day or this morning. Earlier this month, General Alexander Syrsky, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, said Russian forces have become bogged down in the fighting in the area. Connected to that, there are reports that Russian authorities have increased efforts to evacuate residents around the area. Now, quite what that means, we're not entirely sure, because they are Ukrainian residents, so we're not sure what that relates to. However, Ukraine's military said yesterday that it had hit the base of a Russian motorized rifle regiment in the border area, although we can't independently verify that as well. Separately, the Russian Ministry of Defense has been talking about deploying soldiers on motorbikes. These are said to speed across open ground. These are mainly in the east, we think, around the Donbass, launching surprise attacks against Ukrainian units, especially around Volodar, which is southwest of Donetsk. The Russian Ministry of Defense said that motorcycles are almost standard equipment here, They may well be standard equipment now because there's not a lot of other troop-carrying stuff left. But Russian MOD saying motorcycles, almost standard equipment here. It is very difficult to hit such a small and extremely manoeuvrable target. The fighters roll into the trenches of the armed forces of Ukraine at speed and immediately enter battle. Right, that's what they say. I mean, there's been a lot of footage of these bikes just being whacked because, I mean, they might get you from A to B quickly, but you can't do much whilst you're on the bike and people can see and hear you coming. So I've seen a lot of footage of these motorbikes starting off very well and then just being taken down by Ukrainian forces. Now, separately, the Ukrainian 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade has denied reports that Russian forces have captured the village of Novolik-Skandrivka. It's about 20 km northwest of Avdiivka. In a statement issued earlier this morning, the brigade said that claims of the settlement's capture do not correspond with reality, although they did acknowledge that a significant part of the village had been occupied. They said Russian forces don't control the whole thing. Those comments came after information published by Deep State UA, a Ukrainian open source intelligence network, indicated that the settlement had fallen those troops. So this is on the Pokrovsk front in the Donbass, northwest of Donetsk city. Seen some very intense fighting in recent days. Ukraine's general staff said yesterday that area had accounted for over half of all combat actions they had recorded in the previous 24 hours. And one of those attacks had included a Russian missile strike on the town of Pokrovsk itself, killed 4 and injured over 30 others. That comes from the regional officials. According to the officials, Russia attacked the town with 2 Iskander missiles, destroying 1 house and damaging over a dozen others. And then in the south of Ukraine, a couple more for me, south of Ukraine, a Russian strike on Odessa hit civilian infrastructure, injured at least 3 this morning. Ole Kipa, the region's governor, said. Ukraine's Air Force said it shot down all 13 Shahed-type drones and 12 of 16 missiles launched overnight. And elsewhere, Russia continued missile and drone attacks against multiple Ukrainian regions all over the weekend, really, but especially last night, targeting critical energy infrastructure. I spoke to a friend this morning in Kyiv. She said power cuts were now the norm, but people were making do. I asked how she was, and she just said they were struggling and surviving, which kind of sums it up, really. And just to note, one last one from me, David, just to note, it's a year ago today that Prigozhin's march on Moscow was underway, his what he called his March for Justice. You'll remember he was very critical of the direction Russia was taking in the war. He was critical of Russian military and political leaders, and he was talking about rampant corruption. He particularly singled out Shoigu's leadership of the defense ministry and Gerasimov in charge of the armed forces. I mean, Shoigu's obviously been moved on. There have been a series of several high-profile arrests, allegedly around corruption. So maybe old Prigozhin had a point, although he might have expressed it somewhat differently. I note today's British Defence Intelligence update said that the Wagner Group of then is now nothing like it, or Wagner Group today is nothing like it was back then. Today, it's still directed by Prigozhin's son Pavel, led by Anton Lotus Yelizarov. But Wagner has been replaced in Ukraine by this grouping of so-called volunteer forces. And Wagner, the rump of Wagner, is still in Belarus, Mali, and the Central African Republic. British Defence Intelligence know that under Prigozhin's leadership, Wagner led on the recruitment drive of prisoners from July 22 to February 23. The Russian MOD took it over at that point. But they say at least 48,000 prisoners have been recruited and at least 17,000 of them killed, KIA, killed in action. And since the start of the full-scale invasion, they note that Russia's prison population has decreased by 150,000 people, and they assess that a large proportion of those have been drafted into the military and are fighting in Ukraine. And I'll take another pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Francis, can I turn to you next? What diplomatically and politically has been taking your eye?
Well, thanks, David. An eruption of terrorist violence in Dagestan, Russia, could have significant ramifications for Russian domestic security efforts, but it warrants its own section, hence why Roland is going to cover it imminently. In other significant political developments over the weekend and in the past 24 hours or so, I mentioned at the end of last week European Union debates around the latest package of sanctions, the 14th against Russia. That package has now been agreed. and includes a ban on reloading Russian liquefied natural gas in the EU for further shipment to third countries. It also offers the EU more tools to crack down on circumvention of sanctions, as well as targeting an additional 116 Russian individuals and entities. Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, said, quote, "The 14th package of sanctions demonstrates our unity in supporting Ukraine and seeking to limit Russia's criminal activities against Ukrainians, including efforts to circumvent EU measures." The package includes, as we speculated, a crackdown on Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers sneaking the Kremlin's oil to ports across the world. Brussels said it intends to make identifying and designating the ships easier, adding that 27 vessels had already been listed. That move comes after the UK issued the first sanctions on this so-called shadow fleet of ships in early June. It underlines once again how Western powers are seeking to find ways to block third parties and countries from evading sanctions. But it is, of course, a difficult task. We also know that the wording is not quite as robust as some wanted with regards to Russia, but we covered that in detail last week, so I won't repeat myself here. Now, in their analysis, the Kyiv Independent highlights an interesting statistic that exposes the nature of the challenge. A survey conducted by the independent Russian polling firm, the Levanda Center, in June found that only 11% of respondents said that sanctions had personally affected them or their families. Now, of course, that may merely be how people perceive the impact of sanctions rather than the reality. As ever, we don't yet know the long-term damage being wrought on the Russian economy. But nevertheless, it speaks to the failure of Western sanctions to make the war in Ukraine unpopular amongst the population. But to stress, that's not to say that all is rosy in Russia, as Roland will discuss shortly. The war is having major internal implications, particularly on certain regions. But just staying with the EU before we go to that, rumours are swirling that the top jobs within the bloc have been agreed behind closed doors following the EU elections, with Ursula von der Leyen remaining head of the European Commission, Antonio Costa, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, heading the Council, and then Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas as the bloc's chief diplomat. Now, again, this is just rumour and speculation at present. Matters could change, but we understand that's the most likely combination as things stand. Now, in a Ukraine context, of course, this is very unequivocally supportive. Von der Leyen has been a major champion, of course. Kaja Kallas represents perhaps the most hawkish leader within the bloc with regard to stopping the Russians and wanting to see a victory for Ukraine in the conflict. Costa also strongly supported the opening of negotiations for Ukraine's accession to the EU. So all of this, therefore, can be taken as evidence that the EU as an institution is becoming more hardline in the stance it's adopting towards Russia. That goes against what Putin will have hoped, expecting that EU populations would have become gradually exhausted by the war and therefore elected leaders more open to conversations about peace negotiations which saw concessions granted to him. In fact, in Europe, support for Kyiv remains pretty solid. And fascinatingly, and perhaps unexpectedly, more populist right-wing parties in Europe have not, as was widely expected, swung more towards a settlement, regardless of the political cost. Giorgia Meloni in Italy remains a significant supporter of Kyiv, of course, and even in France, Marine Le Pen, who had been quite supportive vocally about Putin in the past, has been forced to adopt a view which sees support for Ukraine continuing were she elected president. It was not supposed to be this way, according to the Kremlin's calculations. But, David, there does appear to be an outlier on that score. Nigel Farage here in Britain, who I'm very happy to talk about later, as I think he serves as an interesting case study with wider ramifications in the European context about what form certain leaders might take with regard to opening negotiations and conversations with Russia. But perhaps more on that later on.
Absolutely. Good idea, Francis. I think Farage does need his own section just because, of course, there's a lot of British political context and detail that needs to be unpacked and explained for our wider audience. But let's turn now to our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant. Roland, you've been looking at the story of this violence in Dagestan in southern Russia. What can you tell us and what might it mean?
Hi, David. Yeah, so death toll's been climbing, and as so often in cases like these, it's taken a while for the proverbial smoke or fog or whatever you want to call it to clear. So just to get the facts down, the current death toll from this terrorist attack is 19 people, most of them police officers, but also several civilians, also 6 gunmen, 6 attackers on top of that. We're told by Russian authorities have been killed, 16 people wounded. So that's the current casualty count. What happened? So this all started around about 6 p.m. last night local time in 2 places in Dagestan, in Derbent, which is a city on the Caspian Sea, way down south near the border with Azerbaijan, and in Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan. So just before 6 p.m, attackers entered the Church of the Intercession in Derbent, where 66-year-old Father Nikolai Kotelnikov was leading the evening service for the Orthodox Festival of Pentecost. Now, we are told by a deputy head of a local oversight body that the attackers slit his throat in front of the congregation before setting fire to the church. They went on to attack the Kili Numas synagogue in Derbent and police officers. And meanwhile, in Makhachkala, at pretty much the same time, so that's about 75 miles further north, there was also an attack on a Russian Orthodox church and a synagogue and a police post. So a coordinated attack. There's lots of footage of this online, as we're so used to these days in the age of smartphones. You can very clearly see these men dressed all in black. They seem to be working in pairs, roaming the streets. A particularly nasty one where there's these 2 traffic policemen who are involved in what looks like a routine traffic stop. They're checking someone's documents, and suddenly these 2 guys in black show up and gun them down. So pretty graphic, nasty kind of terrorism of a kind, I suppose, we've seen before around the world. In terms of responsibility, well, look, we don't have a full claim yet. Now, the affiliate of Islamic State based in Afghanistan, that's the same group that claimed responsibility for the Crocus City Hall attack in Moscow in March. They praised the attack, but they didn't take direct responsibility. They said it was conducted by, quote, brothers in the Caucasus who showed that they are still strong. Now, Russian media are saying that some of the gunmen, they included 2 sons and a nephew of a local politician called Magomed Omarov. He's the head of one regional district near Makhachkala. Russian telegram channels are saying that he admitted to police that he knew his children were followers of Wahhabi Islam, of Salafi Islam, and in Russia generally, and in that part of the world, if you say, Wahhabist is the short term, whatever the accuracy of that claim is, the shorthand term for radical terrorist, basically. He's denied having anything to do with them, however. The Kremlin itself, Vladimir Putin's expressed condolences but hasn't yet talked about attribution. But you've got other people clearly trying to link this to Ukraine. So Sergei Melnikov, the governor of Dagestan, blaming members of Islamic sleeper cells direct from abroad. He's strongly implying the West and Ukraine are trying to sow panic and fear. We understand who's behind the organization of terrorist attacks and what goal they pursue. Same kind of thing from Leonid Slutsky, the chair of the Duma Foreign Affairs Committee. These tragic events, I'm sure, orchestrated from abroad and are aimed at sowing panic and dividing the Russian people. However, I would like to turn at this moment to Dmitry Rogozin, who is probably one of the most rabid's a bit of a loaded word, isn't it? A very well-known and extremely loud-mouthed Russian nationalist of very, very long standing. He's always been quite close to the Kremlin. He's in Ukraine at the moment, a very big supporter of the war. He said on tele, I very seldom find myself agreeing with Dmitry Rogozin, but here's his take. State Duma deputy from Dagestan, Gadzhiev, believes that the intelligence services of Ukraine and NATO countries are behind the terrorist attack in the Republic. But I believe that if we attribute every terrorist attack involving national and religious intolerance, hatred and Russophobia to the machinations of Ukraine and NATO, this pink mist, this mean red fog, will lead us to big problems. And he quotes the Bible, we can see a speck in another's eye, but not the log in our own. It's about time. So I personally think that's very much on the money. We saw all of those very, stretched, dubious, unlikely claims that Ukraine and the West were meant to be behind the Crocus City Hall attack. Absolutely no basis to believe that at all. Like Russia has got, and this part of Russia has a very long-running indigenous problem with radical Islamism and terrorism. And I would suspect that's what's going on here. Exactly why the attack took place right now, we don't know, but it is not the first time we've seen this kind of thing in Dagestan.
Thank you very much, Roland. Before we go to Francis for some reflections on this, can I ask you, there's been a theme amongst some commentators and watchers of this war that the the stress the war in Ukraine puts on the Russian economy and Russian society may eventually, at some point in the future, maybe soon, maybe not so soon, lead to the collapse of the Federation. Events like this sometimes are used as evidence of that, of evidence of a wider collapse of the structures and the way modern Russia is set up. What do you say to that? How do you see these attacks?
I think that's a bit of a leap from something like this to the collapse of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation is built on an empire that was built over centuries. It's got a kind of internal cohesion, whether you like it or not, and it's not really estranged to this kind of thing. I mean, the Caucasus, as we know, has always been a restive part of that federation, empire, whatever you want to call it. Yes, Chechnya did try to secede in the 90s, and there was a very, very bloody war. The Russians won it, and yes, there is this long-running strain of insurgency and radical Islamism, especially down there. And all of those tensions that you get in multi-ethnic societies, right? So especially down Dagestan, we saw this massive outburst of anti-Semitism in late October, just as the Israeli war in Gaza was really getting going after the October 7th attacks. We had people storming the airport in Makhachkala and besieging a hotel because there were rumours that Israeli refugees, Jews, were there and people had poured out. And these are the kind of tensions that you face. I think often when people talk about, Russia might collapse, the Federation will fall apart, that they look at the ethnic republics, places like Dagestan, Chechnya, Udmurtia, Bashkortostan and things like that, and they say, all the various ethnicities will rise up and seize their independence. Well, the Caucasus has a history, obviously. Chechnya has that recent history, but the fact is in lots of those places that they call ethnic republics in Russia, the reality is that there's long been a majority ethnic Russian population, and the original indigenous people from whom it takes its name are very much a minority. So I treat such claims with a degree of skepticism. I think there's a bit of wishful thinking on the part of some of Russia's enemies. Yes, Russia is an imperial state, but it's not like the British Empire, right? It's not like half a dozen Russians in pith helmets came and occupied a country of millions of people and can therefore be kicked out quite quickly. So I would caution against such predictions.
Thank you very much, Roland. We'll come back to you at the end, of course, for a final thought. But Francis, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting reflections from Roland. I just, it's very specific to this particular issue in the narrow context of the past few months and these kind of terrorist attacks. I think it's going to be very interesting seeing the impact of it on the understanding within the Kremlin as to the fact that its focus on Ukraine is meaning that perhaps, I emphasise that word, it is becoming more exposed on other threats to Russia and to the state. Of course, Putin was in some ways swept to power as a response to trying to stamp out Islamist terror. Once these things start emerging, and it's obviously deeper within Russia, people will start saying, well, hang on a minute, the covenant that we made with the state, that we wouldn't get being blown up and that our prosperity would continue, is being broken here. So that's a possibility. I think also as well, the fact that the Kremlin is again using its propagandists to peddle this idea that somehow the West is behind that. Of course, there may well be large numbers of the population who do believe that, but there'll be many who don't, and Roland's just described one of them there. If you're lying about something as obvious as this, with Kyiv not being involved, it may be the sign of when people start to say, well, hang on, what else are we not being told that's true here about this war in Ukraine? Maybe some of the rumours about the losses are also actually true, and that we're being lied to about the scales of the defeats that we've suffered in the past 2 years. So a couple of interesting things and musings and what it tells us about the way that things might well evolve over the coming weeks and months.
Well, thank you very much, Roland and Francis, for talking us through that story. But Francis, can I stay with you? The big political story over the weekend is to do with Nigel Farage. Listeners outside the UK may have heard his name, but I think it's worth just talking through this story and reflecting a little bit on what it might mean for the, well, until now, certainly the consensus of the UK support for Ukraine. Francis Dearnley.
Thanks. Gosh, it's hard to know where to start, really. I'll try and be brief. The name Farage, as you say, will be known to all listeners in Britain for his championing of Brexit, and to some in the United States too for his vocal support for Donald Trump. He used to be a warm-up act in 2016 and indeed has also spoken at rallies during his presidency and indeed since then. He was a long-time member of the European Parliament, not because he was in favour of it, but because he used it as a platform to denounce its bureaucracy and unelected elements and champion for British independence from it. But some of his viral speeches will also be known to European listeners. He is a figure that does also have a slightly international appeal to those who are on the more Eurosceptic wing of politics in the European context. Now, here at the moment in Britain, he leads an insurgent right-wing party known as Reform UK, which has just overtaken the Conservatives in polling, which has never happened before. Farage, in essence, came out of retirement in order to lead this party, and it has caused something of an earthquake here in this general election period. He was set to win around a lot of disaffected voters on the right who felt let down by the Conservatives for their failures on reducing immigration, for lowering taxes, etc. But this major row you just referenced has broken out here due to his doubling down on his previously stated views regarding the war in Ukraine. Namely that, in essence, the West provoked Russia into invading the country, and the explicit quote that he made in an interview last week is that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was being the particular thing that was responsible for it. Now, those comments were made in a BBC Panorama interview with Nick Robinson, echoing, of course, arguments that are sometimes made by Donald Trump, which, as I say, Farage is very familiar with. Now, he was pressed on whether this rhetoric was echoing that of Putin, and Farage said, of course, it's his fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse. And he then doubled down on his argument in an opinion piece for the Telegraph. Now, the response from other politicians, particularly in the Telegraph, has been swift. Tobias Ellwood, the former Tory defence minister, told us this is a shocking statement by Farage. A sovereign state was illegally invaded and he blames the West. Churchill will be turning in his grave. Putin, already enjoying how Farage is disrupting British politics, will be delighted to hear this talk of appeasement. It shows Farage can never lead the Conservatives. And that's a critical point here. Many speculated that Farage, who is, by polling that's been conducted on this question, the most popular party leader in Britain, might be the one to unify the right and lead a Conservative party after this election, where the Conservatives are expected to be trounced. Now, other reactions: Lord West of Spithead, the former chief of the naval staff, anyone who gives any excuse to Putin and his disgraceful attack on an independent country is standing into danger as regards their views on world affairs. Liam Fox, former defence secretary for the Conservatives: the West did not provoke this war in Ukraine, and it is shocking that Farage should say so. Sovereign nations have a right to defend themselves and organise their security in a way that they choose. We need unequivocal military and moral support for the people of Ukraine, not Kremlin apologists. A Labour spokesman, interestingly, as well. And I mention Labour here because, of course, they are widely expected to become the next governing party here in Britain, led by Sir Keir Starmer. So their remarks do matter on Ukraine. Quote, "These are disgraceful comments. A Putin apologist who should never be trusted with our nation's security. Up until now, there has been a united front among Britain's political leaders in supporting the people of Ukraine against the unprovoked and unjustifiable assault they have suffered at the hands of Putin." Farage has put himself outside of that united position and shown that he would rather lick Putin's boots than stand up for the people of Ukraine. That makes him unfit for any political office in our country. Now, just lastly, in the British context, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, too, has waded in, accusing Farage of spreading Kremlin propaganda, calling it nauseating ahistorical drivel and more propaganda. Nobody provoked Putin. Nobody poked the bear with a stick. The people of Ukraine voted overwhelmingly in 1991 to be a sovereign and independent country. They were perfectly entitled to seek both NATO and EU membership. There is only one person responsible for Russian aggression against Ukraine, both in 2014 and 22, and that is Putin. To try to spread the blame is morally repugnant and parroting Putin's lies. And even Zelensky's waded in, saying Farage has been infected with the virus of Putin. So I think it's fair to say people aren't too chuffed about those remarks here in Britain, but such a response needs to be understood beyond just the nature of the remarks themselves, but the threat that Farage poses to politicians on the left and the right. This gives Conservative MPs in particular something they can use to attack Farage with, in the hope that it rallies supporters back to the Conservative Party, something which anecdotally actually is happening in response to the remarks that Farage has made. But it explains some of the anger, as well, of course, as people just generally being outraged by these kind of remarks being articulated, given the nature of the war. The Ministry of Defence even put out a video trying to dispel the myth that NATO is an aggressor, as they call it, and saying that NATO has worked for peace, security and freedom for 75 years against Russian aggression, and it emphasises that NATO previously made significant efforts to establish a strategic partnership with Russia, which then Russia broke. So considerable upset here in Britain, showing the unity of feeling on Ukraine, but also serving as an example of how some figures on the right, as on the far left, can find themselves in a different position on the war than might be the consensus. And I think we should expect to hear more of this kind of argument over the coming months. Just one final thing that Farage did say in his remarks was that obviously his interpretation of the war is, as to how it started, has led to widespread condemnation. There has not been as much condemnation as the second part, which is where he said that we've got into this war, but we're not giving Ukraine what it needs to win. And in that, I think you could say that there is some truth to that. But certainly in terms of the fundamental cause of this war, I think many people would challenge his view on this, something that he has been consistent on for 10 years now. So that's where we are in terms of that discussion, David. I don't want to come across as being very Anglo-centric for our international listeners, which is why I try and broaden it out as being something we may well see being articulated by other European leaders over the coming months as this war rages on.
Thank you very much, Francis. Yes, I think it's important to talk about it. I mean, for me, it seems like the first potential crack in the political consensus here. It's very interesting how, when we could call them the establishment, but maybe that's a word that Farage would use, how hard they came down on those remarks. So it's definitely a story that we'll have to keep in mind and keep on looking at over the next few months as the UK general election approaches. Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis and Roland's final thoughts. Just a quick message from us before we move on. On Saturday the 29th of June, Ukraine the Latest will be doing a live show at the Stephen Joseph Theatre in Scarborough in the northeast of England. The show will be in the early evening, and myself, Dom, Francis and Roland Oliphant will be discussing the military lessons for the West from 2 years of the full-scale invasion. For tickets, just go to the Scarborough Fair website or follow the link in the show notes. We really look forward to seeing you there. Let's go to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'd like to go back to the reaction to this strike in Crimea and what we think's happened on the beach there and Mikhailo Podolyak's comments. And I just want to try and ask you to help me get my head around the spectrum of morality, if you may, and give me a moment to explain this. So, soldier and civilian. There's a whole gulf between them. It's not just one or the other, not binary. There's the international humanitarian law recognition of the phrase DPH, direct participation in hostilities. So if you're a civilian and you are directly participating in hostilities, for the time that you're doing that, you are said to relinquish your protections under Geneva Conventions, and you are therefore targetable by a foreign military force. Now, there's some debate about, does direct participation in hostilities mean that you are actively killing people on the other side, or just, fixing tanks or operating radar systems or what have you. So quite where a civilian is when he or she relinquishes their right to protections, that's open for debate. But I would suggest sunbathers are not in that category. Sunbathers who are occupying stolen houses in Crimea, I think still not in that category. But now let's have a look at soldiers, and in particular I want to look at, so the soldiers actively engaged in military activity. Of course, they are legitimate military targets in an armed conflict. How do soldiers operate in the age of drones? You may have seen some footage over the weekend of a Ukrainian drone where you see a Russian soldier who is basically running, and then he sort of pleads with this drone, holds his hands together, almost praying. He's clearly begging for his life. He runs off again, and then he's hit by this drone, and we assume killed because there's a very large explosion. So I ask you, if you're a soldier and you then choose to surrender, you are hors de combat, you're outside combat, you are no longer taking part in hostilities, you are then protected under Geneva Conventions, and you should be afforded every protection by the opposing force. But how do you surrender in good faith to a drone? You could pretend to surrender, wait for the battery to die. You could pretend to surrender whilst your mates try and take the drone out, in which case, is that a case of perfidy? It would be such if you were doing that to an enemy soldier and they came towards you to accept your surrender and then were shot by some of your mates hiding behind a tree, for example. So, where are we in this area, this murky world, murky moral area between being an outright soldier participating in a war and a civilian? And it's a very difficult area. And I think this incident over the weekend really demands that we look at it and think about it and talk about it. There will be some people out there who take delight in the death of every single Russian soldier, civilian, soldier surrendering, civilian taking part in hostilities, or et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's not black and white. It's very easy to say that these people on the beach would not have been harmed or killed if Russia hadn't invaded. And that is correct, but I think it's just too simplistic a moral position. It doesn't feel right for me to hold that position and engage in no further debate. So I ask for your help. Where are we on this spectrum now of morality between soldier, civilian, participating in hostilities? How do you surrender? How do you say you don't want to take part in any combat in the age of drone warfare? Where are we on sunbathers in an occupied part of Ukraine? Bear in mind, we don't know who these people were. They may have been before, they may have lived there before 2014, so they may be Ukrainian nationals. And Mikhailo Podolyak's very, very strong view there hasn't taken that into account. So I ask for your help. Where are we? How should we think about this? I think it's wrong to take delight in the death of every single Russian, no matter what. There has to be some room for morality. As I said earlier on, I don't believe a baby can be a civilian occupier of Ukraine, but it's an extremely difficult subject area to discuss and to think about, and it's very easy to take black and white moral positions on this, which I won't do because I think that's just wrong. But I ask for your help in how we frame the debate about how to think about this before we talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dom. Nicholls. Roland Oliphant, can I come to you next?
Okay, two things. First of all, on Nigel Farage, I think it's really interesting that he said this now, just because you were talking about the consensus, right? And you mentioned the crack in the consensus. Someone was saying to me, a friend of mine was saying, have you noticed how he's been really quiet about that? Just a few months ago I was having a conversation how Farage used to make these kinds of remarks back in 2014. He'd talk about poking the Russian bear and blah, blah, blah. And he shut up about it after February 2022. So I think it's quite interesting this has come up now. And I wonder why. I wonder whether he's sensing that there is an opportunity or a shift that allows him to start articulating those views again. But as you say, very, weird little moment, something to watch. On the bigger things, you asked me about these questions about incidents like the frankly horrible terrorist attack in Dagestan may be fueling the collapse of Russia, and I kind of poo-pooed it. But since it is, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, I hope you haven't got something lined up for answers. Since it is the anniversary of Prigozhin's March for Justice, I want to make another observation, which, to be fair, a friend also made to me, but I'll share it with you, and that is, since the beginning of this war, we can pinpoint at least two very, very narrow escapes that the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, the Russian army have survived. The first was in the autumn of 2022, following the Ukrainian kind of blitzkrieg in Kharkiv, a massive collapse. I've spoken to many people about this, and it seems pretty clear that they were much closer to a total collapse of the Russian army than we even thought at the time. And they managed to survive it, they managed to avert it, but they came really, really close to a complete and utter catastrophe there. And the second narrow escape was, of course, Prigozhin's coup. And it's very easy to say in retrospect, well, it was never going to work. But for a few hours, we were watching to find out what were the Siloviki going to do? What were the other agencies going to do? Were people going to stand aside when they were going to face him down? It didn't work in the end, but it was a narrow escape. And the longer this war goes on, the more chances there are of similar, I suppose I've used that word before, black swans and stuff. I don't for a moment want to suggest that terror attack in Dagestan looks like that, or the beginning of that, but don't rule them out would be my thought.
Thank you very much, Dom and Roland. Francis, would you like the very final words?
Thanks, David. Well, my final thought tallies very nicely with both of those, actually, which is I too wanted to use Prigozhin as a hook to talk about a piece we've got in the Telegraph today by Richard Overy, very distinguished military historian, will be known to many listeners for his books on the war, particularly books of analysis, so not just narrative histories of the period, but also analysis to, for example, why the Allies won, which is a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, not least for its reflections on Bomber Command. But to Roland's point, he's written this piece talking about really the nature of war and the nature of history. And we'll have a link in the show notes. But what he really wants to inject into the conversations around the war in Ukraine, particularly, and indeed Taiwan and China, is contingency and the unpredictable, and the sense in which history does not follow set patterns, and the tendency for us to think that things like World War II were inevitable because of the mistakes made after the First World War. And indeed, that is not really how history works. And as I've said many times, there is a tendency, I think, for people to point at, say, Russia's logistical power and say, well, therefore, Russia's victory in this war is inevitable. And as Roland's just emphasised, there have been two narrow escapes in this conflict, which would put pay to some of that analysis. But Richard Overy, in this piece, he talks about how, as well, crises develop in directions that are very difficult to predict. In 1914, he says, the wheels once set in motion are hard to stop, and the crisis grows, but few would have predicted that it would take the trajectory that it did. He then talks about various plausible scenarios where we enter a much more dangerous international context, a sort of World War III type situation. And he paints them in detail, where he talks about China invades Taiwan, and then that leads to a certain domino, that leads to a certain domino. And he just says, and he emphasizes, he says, these scenarios are possible, though not one of them, I should make clear, is probable. But again, it's about us having those kind of conversations about probability versus black swan events versus broader trends. That's what history is. History is about that flexibility, and there are things that can happen that take a different direction than anybody could have predicted. So it's an interesting piece, one that I recommend. And again, it emphasises that nobody wanted World War I or World War II to happen. It sounds like an obvious point, but it happened by decisions being made, and at certain points it became too late to avoid the outcomes that we all know. And that is, of course, the danger in history, is that you pass certain points without ever realising that you passed them. So anyway, we'll have a link in the show notes to that very interesting piece by Richard Overy. And again, on this anniversary of Prigozhin, just remember contingency in history. We all still have agency in this war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.